What up guys, Dying Light 2 is set to release tomorrow and I've been putting a ton of hours into it, so I thought I'd make a review and talk about some of the new things the game brings, such as the parkour and parkour combat, choice making, and all of the new mechanics without getting into any spoilers. There were a lot of skeptics during the long waiting period for Dying Light 2 to release, and for good reason. I mean, look at almost every game that releases nowadays. Cyberpunk 2077 is pretty much the pinnacle of just how fast a fan base can turn on a game and go from one of the most hyped games to one of the worst releases of all time. And then most recently, Far Cry 6, which even though I enjoyed playing a new Far Cry game and had fun making videos, it was massively disappointing. Then you have Dying Light 2 getting multiple delays, which back in the day was almost a good sign to see because that meant that they were just polishing the game up and making sure they released something that's finished, but nowadays it usually means it'll still end up unfinished. Luckily for Dying Light 2, however, the delays were worth it. I did get some bugs, but Techland sent me a copy of Dying Light 2 a few days early, so all of the bugs took place before release, and will likely get patched out or have been by this point since they're supposedly patching 1,000 different issues with the day one patch. And I do like to point out when I get a game early because I think there are bound to be some type of bias from all these big gaming review companies when they get a game early, even if it's just a little bit of a bias. But I did purchase the game myself so I could play it on PC as well as the PS5 and PS4. And even on the PS4 it looks pretty damn good, and when you take it to the PS5 it just looks so damn crisp. Not everything in the game looks amazing, but especially the character models are just so sharp. Like there's some scenes where it's kind of dark and they look real. With PC it was okay. I played it on a 1060 as well as a 3060, and obviously the 3060 is going to outperform the 1060, which the 1060 looks closer to how it looks on a PS4 most of the time. But a good portion of the time, the performance and optimization on the PC period wasn't too great, with constant drops in frame rate. No matter what I do, I couldn't maintain 60 frames per second for long on either graphics card. Recently, God of War came to PC, and the optimization between these two games are night and day. Where God of War right off the bat felt so damn good, Dying Light 2 has been hit and miss. Obviously, they're two hugely different games and God of War already had the PlayStation port, but I think it's worth mentioning the performance difference. But what about the actual game? The parkour has changed a bit. In the original Dying Light, you could run around free, and if there was something climbable, which most things were, you could freely climb it without having to do much work. Now with the sequel, you'll need to level up your stamina if you want to get to some of the higher and harder points to climb. This doesn't affect some of the parkour you'll be doing since a lot of it is just hopping over a ledge quickly or jumping over something, but it is a pretty big focus of the game. As you level up, you'll be able to increase your stamina, which will allow you to get to places you couldn't get to before, like certain landmarks such as a water tower or windmill that you can climb on top of for some good loot. It can make some of the more normal stuff like climbing a regular old building a little more challenging though, since you'll have to stop and stand there and regain some of your stamina sometimes in order to keep going, kind of similar to Breath of the Wild. This also gets a little more complex later on in the game, where you'll come across different modes of travel like a paraglider, and running out of stamina while riding this thing can make you go for a pretty big fall. Stamina is also used for the combat, especially with the additions of the crazy parkour combat Dying Light 2 has going for it, where you have all of these different skills, bringing back the dropkick alongside all of these new skills that allow you to do different moves while bouncing off of enemies. By the way, I love the parkour in here, but I can also see the side of someone that hates it, because at some points it makes me want to freaking scream. Most of the time it feels pretty crisp, like a more tuned up version of the first one, but then it feels like they got so spicy with it that it made it annoying just to mantle over the simplest objects. I remember hearing a rumor at some point, I can't remember when, that the original Dying Light was supposed to have choices that affect the story, and while that wasn't the case with the first game, it is the case with Dying Light 2. If you played the Guardians of the Galaxy game, that's the most recent game I've played with similar choice-making mechanics where a choice might mean next to nothing, while another one, which usually has a timer on it making you pick within a few seconds, might be a pretty big change in how the next segments of the game are going to play out. I'll have some more videos up soon on different choices you can make and all of the different outcomes, so don't forget to subscribe. The world of Dying Light 2 is pretty huge, so you can see where those 500 hours of content that they talked about before release are coming from. Should it need to take that long to 100% complete a game? I actually hate that aspect of Dying Light 2, because with me, I can't stop playing a game until I fully complete it. But the story itself I think takes around 20 to 25 hours. And by the way, I don't know where those 500 hours of content comes from. Maybe that's the additional release of content that they're going to have, because they do have a lot of post-launch plans for content, but I think to 100% complete the game, it takes around 50 hours. After you complete the story, you'll just be hopping all over town completing side missions and nighttime quests given to you by different civilians living in the world, which is a huge difference between the first game and the second, because now the world feels actually lived in. And remember in Dying Light 1 how you'd get a weapon and you could repair it a certain amount of times depending on the tier of the weapon? Well, that is actually gone in Dying Light 2. There are different methods to make it harder to have your weapon destroyed and increase its lifespan, but you'll be going through weapons even faster than you did in Dying Light 1. Guns also really aren't a thing in here, since over time they've slowly disappeared and nobody's manufactured them since the outbreak. But there is a pretty heavy focus on bows and crossbows, even introducing some crazy skills you can use with your bow, allowing you to go in a sort of deadeye effect and kill multiple enemies at once. Again, I'm not going to have any spoilers in this video, but the story was pretty alright. It started out pretty damn good and then kind of declined some, but I'm still surprised to see so much hate on it. Like, a ton of reviews out there give it shit, but what did you expect? Like God of War, Last of Us level story? I don't know, maybe I was playing a different Dying Light, but the first game didn't have some exceptionally well-written cinematic masterpiece of a story, nor was the story really a crazy focus. I'm not a huge die-hard Dying Light fan, like some of y'all will be bigger fans than me for sure, but for me, I think the story was way better than the first one. The biggest complaint I have is how corny the villain was. It almost felt like he belonged in Wolfenstein instead and was in the wrong setting. The thing that gets me is where a bunch of companies rated Far Cry 6 higher than Dying Light 2. I don't see in what world Far Cry 6 is the better game, especially when your main issue is the story. Did you not play Far Cry 6? In what freaking world is that story better? You'd have to try your absolute hardest to write a worse and more forgettable story than Far Cry 6, and you still wouldn't be able to. If the cutscenes weren't skippable in Far Cry 6, I'd have to stab my eyeballs out because of every goddamn character was so forgettable, and I barely remember a single one of them. It boggles my baby smooth brain how generic ass Far Cry 6 is seen as a better game than Dying Light 2. I also seen in IGN's review that they had non-stop bugs and technical issues, and I almost feel like they're just trying to roll some of that Cyberpunk 2077 hate over onto this one because negative news gets views, and played an early release and ran into some bugs and crashes. Like, what do you expect? I ran into some annoying bugs, but nothing like game breaking. I don't know what they're really talking about. And then after all of that, they still gave it a 7. They act if they're disgusted for even touching the game and then still give it a 7. Like a 7 in IGN brain equals like a 4 in regular people's brains, I guess. For a Techland game, I think this is the best story we've gotten. Dead Island felt super arcadey, and I don't even remember the story because it was just that unimportant, while the first Dying Light still had a bit of the Dead Island feel, where you're just thrown right into the gameplay and the story is just secondary to everything else, including the gameplay, which was really the main focus. And I'm not saying the gameplay isn't a huge focus now, but they seem to have evened it out a little bit to where it's not a groundbreaking story, but I'm still actually invested in the story right from the start. The soundtrack, by the way, was beautiful. I haven't really heard anybody mention that, but one of the pieces they play at some points in Dying Light 2 almost makes my brain grow ripples. But yeah, I think Dying Light 2 is definitely worth it. It feels like I'm actually playing a sequel. If you're back in 2015 and someone told you Dying Light 2 was going to be released in 7 years as a new generation of consoles, this is what I imagine everyone would be hoping to see. It's certainly not a perfect game, but it amazes me to see an open world game that tries to innovate at least a little bit be the one that gets called out for being generic. They didn't just improve the graphics or expand the map with less content and slap the number 2 on the logo. This is actually what you'd expect from a sequel. A whole new experience where everything has been improved and expanded upon without lowering the quality. You can tell the developers actually wanted to make a good game. But yeah, that's it. Don't forget to leave a like and subscribe for more Dying Light 2 videos. See ya.